Good morning and welcome once again to West Valley Unitarian Universalist Church's Zoom service this first Sunday of the new year. My name is Ann Harper. I am worship associate for this Sunday's service. It's a real joy to see so many here this morning. My screen is telling me we have 25 in attendance. That's a wonderful, wonderful way to start the new year. Am I sensing a genuine spirit of hope and anticipation? These are our opening words today. We need one another when we would accomplish some great purpose. We need one another in an hour of success. We need when we look for someone to share our triumphs. We need one another in the hour of defeat, when with encouragement we might endure and stand again. All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us. We begin our service each week with the lighting of our handsome, inspiring chalice. Paul, if you would do the honors, I offer these words of Dag Hammarskjöld. Dear, I've lost my sequence here. As Unitarian Universalists, we have not bound ourselves to a creed or to dogma. Rather, we enter into a covenant with each other, agreeing to do our best to live by the principles listed therein. Okay, Paul, if you would please change our screens now to include our covenant so we can read it together. Thank you. Love is the doctrine of our congregation. The quest for truth is our holy right, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in friendship. Thus do we covenant. It is more than a building. It is a community of people currently wishing we could hug and break bread under the ray canopy and sing together in our sanctuary. We also realize that such a gathering is simply not wise until we can feel safe from the coronavirus. So patience is still our byword until the all clear is sounded. Meanwhile, the patio and the sanctuary, the RE building, our fellowship space, and the grounds still need to be maintained. There's the mortgage, city water, power, the needs for which have not altered. Each week we take up an offering to help sustain our buildings and campus. During the following offertory music, you could use this quiet time to write your supporting check, which can be mailed to the church, or you might consider a scheduled auto pay arrangement with your bank. A new consideration: if you are a stimulus recipient and are among those fortunate enough not to really need all of it, the keepers of West Valley's coffers would rejoice in your sharing. I'm just thanking Rocky for his music and asking what instrument he was playing. Was it an accordion or an organ? Well, we can get to that later. Okay, so here we go. Emily Whitmore is a longtime member of our congregation, one of a small but growing block of youthful congregants, just what we need to keep our perspectives fresh and our ideals inspired. A journalist by profession, Emily is also a highly respected graphic designer. She is a strong voice of advocacy for the National Resources Defense Council and the Environmental Defense Fund. Here at West Valley, Emily has edited our monthly newsletter and presided over our board of trustees. Her inquisitive mind has led her into the territory of apocalyptic dystopia, views of which she will share with us this morning. Emily.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I also want to thank Paul and Barry and the Worship Services Committee for inviting me back to the pulpit this morning. This month's theme is consolation and desolation. And when Barry told me that, my knee-jerk reaction was to talk about climate change again. I asked him if that made me a one-trick pony, to which Barry very diplomatically replied, "I think it fits the theme." But he never did answer my question though. But really though, the phrase consolation and desolation, it reminded me of a dialogue facilitated by Extinction Rebellion's Claire Farrell titled On Collapse and Hope, featuring Caroline Hickman of Climate Psychology Alliance and Naresh Giogrande of Transition Towns and Deep Adaptation Project. A recurring theme in the discussion was the, quote, false dichotomy between naive hope and doom-mongering, nihilistic despair. Now, I am going to resist the urge to rattle off a bunch of climate statistics to you right now, because for some, I'd be preaching to the choir again. And for others, statistics are not what's going to change your mind. Because let's face it, if they were, you'd be in the choir already. And there are a few bits of good news in the works too. I don't want to discount them, but we really need to crank those efforts up to 11 in a very short amount of time, and we are not quite there yet. But there is one foreboding piece of information, not from any scientific institution, but rather a financial one. Just last month, water joined gold, oil, and other commodities traded on Wall Street, highlighting worries that the life-sustaining natural resource may become scarce across more of the world. Now, I'm currently reading Dune right now in anticipation for the new movie coming out, and apparently I'm also growing my hair out to look like Timothée Chalamet, apparently. But let me tell you, those characters seem to be having a lot of fun living on a planet in which the possession of water is considered a sign of great wealth. I also saw 2015's The Big Short, and absolutely nothing bad came of making a profit off of the likelihood that people would not be able to afford a basic human right. Now, making book and movie references like that might seem like I'm making light of the gravity of the situation, but I don't think I'm alone in the fact that popular media helps me to relate to and process what's going on in this world around us. And since the sermon I write wouldn't be complete without referencing the beautiful thinker Charles Eisenstein, who constantly refers to our society and the values we uphold in terms of stories, the stories we create hold great power to shape our beliefs about the world, and our beliefs matter. Which brings me to the role that popular culture plays in all of this. The stories that we tell and how that affects our expectations of and our reactions to this dystopian future hurtling toward us at an alarming speed. Quick warning, some minor spoiler, like movie spoilers ahead, but most of these movies are older, and also I'll try not to give away too much. And Also, this will get political. It has to be done in order for me to prove a point that I'm making. It can't be helped. Sorry, not sorry. Okay, here we go. There's a satirical news show I like to watch, and it's titled Some More News, which released a feature-length episode on November 2nd, read the day before the general election, titled Our Popcorn Movie Dystopia. All of the stress and uncertainty had taken its toll on our lovably disheveled news dude, Cody Johnston, who simply tries to unwind by watching movies, but he can't because, quote, the villains are very often authoritarian, anger-driven, spiteful, petty, rude, dim-witted, dishonest, the obviously greedy people in power, the lowest of hanging fruit for writers to quickly convey that a person is bad, to be defeated, quite often, literally, just a version of Donald Trump. He cites examples such as Dennis Hopper's King Koopa from the 1993 Super Mario Brothers movie. And I just have to share an image link just really quick in the chat because you're not going to believe it. That is not photoshopped. That's just what Dennis Hopper's face looks like. It's in the movie. I've seen the clip. Tom Wilson's Biff Tannen, particularly in 1989's Back to the Future Part 2, Christopher Walken's Max Schreck in 1992's Batman Returns, John Glover's Daniel Clamp in 1990's Gremlins 2, The New Batch, and Ron Silver's Senator McComb in 1994's Time Cop. Even Sesame Street has a character named Donald Grump, and, not to be outdone, Trump himself plays Waldo's dad in 1994's The Little Rascals, a billionaire who steals a woman's popcorn and then in an outtake allegedly spits that popcorn out on a kid's head. Johnston says, so when people talk about Trump derangement syndrome as like a thing liberals have, what they're usually describing is a generation of people raised with the common knowledge that Donald Trump is a bad man who should not be trusted. And then that generation watched their friends and family happily elect him, whether as a welcome destructive force or as a guy they liked and agreed with. The stories we tell ourselves have power. Trump has been threatening to run for office since the 80s, so we told stories about what that might be like. And then when it wound up coming true, it was like we were just all extras in one of those movies in which the villain just was now in power, just as we all knew he would eventually be someday. Johnston then goes on to talk about post-apocalyptic disaster movies in the same vein, saying that it's as if the writers and directors and artists know that the blind optimism and lack of action in the 80s and 90s are now coming around to bite us. So just for fun, my husband and I, along with two other friends in like a text thread, tried to come up with a list of as many dystopian future movies, TV shows, and video games that we could think of. And without breaking a sweat, we came up with like 43 of them. So I'm going to list a bunch of them here. These are including, not limited to, The Road, The Mad Maxes, The Blade Runners, 12 Monkeys, Brazil, Lost in Space, 2012, Children of Men, V for Vendetta, The Hunger Gameses, Ready Player One, The Terminators, Logan, Looper, minor spoiler alert, but the new Christopher Nolan movie Tenet, The Day After Tomorrow, The Matrices, The Book of Eli, The Postman, Waterworld, Escape from New York, Interstellar, Elysium, Idiocracy, Death Stranding, and, for the kids, Pixar's WALL-E. Johnston says, we've completely normalized the cynicism, assuming we're going to live in some future dystopia ravaged by climate change and corruption, to the point that pretty much every movie or TV show that takes place in the future is about that. It just is definitely happening. And just, it's almost as if, because they certainly weren't going to change and just continued to trash the environment and gather massive amounts of wealth, they knew subconsciously that all of their kids would have to prepare for whatever disaster they caused, but not actually stop it from happening until the last possible second. Like a frog on a hot plate, we have just been conditioned to expect and accept the worst, and maybe crave it a little bit. On that note, Johnston says that one exception to this dystopian future narrative is 2015's Tomorrowland, but almost in a more of a meta commentary on the genre sort of way. And I'm going to get into some spoiler alerts, just FYI, if you haven't seen Tomorrowland. In the movie, the scientists who built Tomorrowland gain the ability to see into the future and learn unequivocally that humanity is about to end. In an effort to avoid this, Hugh Laurie's character Nix tries to warn humanity of our impending demise, but this backfires. Humanity not only reacts to Nix's doom-mongering with nihilistic despair that there is nothing that we can do to stop it, but we also begin creating movies and TV shows and video games and books based on the idea of a dystopian future, essentially creating a feedback loop. Our cynicism causes the disaster to become inevitable. Now, I'm going to set down our popcorn movie dystopia just for a moment, but I am going to come back to it because now I'd like to explore the forces that we will need to keep us from slipping into that nihilistic despair. One of the post-apocalyptic works of fiction that I listed just a moment ago is Stranding. You may or may not recognize the name as the video game that my husband wrote about in our newsletter's media review back in May. And for those of you who don't remember or don't get our newsletter, I'm going to reiterate a bit of that review here. In Stranding, you play as Sam Bridges, a delivery man navigating a post-apocalyptic United States. In addition to making deliveries, the main objective is to reopen a communication network between the disparate human settlements. While there are enemies and combat, these situations are few and far between. Instead, the game relies on the world itself to tell its story. Sam is often completely alone, struggling to get from point A to point B through a desolate wilderness. The idea of interconnection drives the gameplay, story, and theme. When Sam arrives at a new destination, he connects the communication network and achieves his objective. This allows for information sharing, which develops the game's story of social collapse and a breakdown in the barrier between the living and the dead. They both build the theme of Death Stranding, the interconnection between life and death, the broken connections that broke the world, and the certainty that reconnection can save it again, end quote. There are also angry ghosts, and it rains time, which makes it really dangerous to be outside. It's a very bizarre and beautiful game. And it also has an interactive online component with other players, but not in the typical multiplayer fashion in which you see other avatars making their own perilous journeys, like across your screen. Rather, the only way that you can interact with the other players are through digital signposts with emojis and words of encouragement that you can only see once you have reopened the communication network in your area. Players can also leave you supplies and tools to help make your journey easier, such as a ladder or a bridge, encouraging teamwork and collaboration, even among complete strangers who you will never get to see or think. So I know that playing a game about a world where there's an invisible threat that keeps everyone trapped inside, forced into artificial distance, relying solely on virtual communication and the good work of delivery services is not exactly escapist in this day and age, but it did help to drive home for us humanity's inherent need for connection and an inclination toward altruism. In Tom Vanderlinden's video essay, Unraveling Death Stranding's Existentialist Themes, he says, people still need to find meaning in a world that seems to be moving toward annihilation. The unwavering human spirit that struggles on and dares to love despite knowing that it may all lead to nothing. Going through tremendous efforts for small acts of kindness, caring about other players, and lending them the helping hand that gives them a fighting chance in an otherwise desperate situation. The reward found in sacrificing for others in the struggle to make each other's lives a little easier. This game challenges the assumption that made by so many other post-apocalyptic movies that I have mentioned already, the Mad Maxes and the Waterworlds and the Roads, that mankind will just like devolve into aggressive hordes of roving gangs and sometimes even cannibals. But real life seems to show us another story. In a different video essay by the same guy, Tom van der Linden, titled "Who We Really Are When Everything Goes Wrong," he uses the example of the response to Hurricane Katrina, which shows it was one that was overwhelmingly defined by selflessness, bravery, and love for our fellow human beings. They prove how the acts of kindness that disaster stories tend to frame as exceptional are actually not so exceptional at all. Generally, a crisis brings out not the worst, but the best in us. Now, there are plenty of real life examples of this I can go into. There's a whole book written by Rebecca Solnit titled "Paradise Built in Hell" that goes into greater detail about mankind's responses in the face of disaster. So I'm not going to get into all of these, but most recently, in the infamous year of 2020, which already conjures up very negative connotations of isolation and civil unrest, we also saw tens of thousands of mutual aid networks and projects emerging around the world since the COVID-19 pandemic began. There's one here in Phoenix, if you want to check it out. The website is mutualaidphx.com. I'll put that in the chat later, but not right now because I'm busy. Emphasizing a focus on solidarity, not charity. Mutual aid is all about cooperation because, as the toolkit puts it, we recognize that our well-being, health, and dignity are all bound up in each other. Or, as American leader in social movements for civil rights, socialism, nonviolence, and gay rights, Bayard Rustin said, "We are all one, and if we don't know it, we will learn it the hard way." Now, that's not to say that there are no examples of violence in times of crisis brought on by mistrust and paranoia. But more often than not, it originates as a sort of preemptive measure of self-defense, which essentially causes a feedback loop, Tomorrowland style. According to van der Linden, how we view ourselves and those around us strongly affects our attitude and our actions. I wonder how much of that mistrust can be attributed to these dystopian stories that we've internalized. But we are not destined to live in a world filled with roving hordes of cannibals, because when the chips are down, we consistently look to each other to help and be helped. German social psychologist Erich Fromm identified 5 distinctively human or existential things beyond biological needs that we all need to be healthy. The first is relatedness, a love and connection with others. The second is transcendence, or a creative aptitude. The third is rootedness, feeling at home outside of the home that you were born in. The fourth is a sense of identity, or awareness of ourselves as a separate person. And the fifth is a frame of orientation, a consistent philosophy by which we find our way through the world. Hopefully, West Valley UU fills that fifth need for many of you. We are constantly, even if it's subconsciously, striving to build connections, to create things, to establish roots, to figure out who you are and what makes you, you, my UUs, and to find a lens through which we could perceive reality. It is in that sense of love, belonging, and understanding that we find meaning and purpose in our lives. They are the reasons we have proven ourselves to be a cooperative and empathetic species. We love this planet, because that's where the people who we love live. It's where our art and our culture we created exist. It's where we made our home. And for us, at least, our faith tradition emphasizes the respect for the interdependent web of life for which we are all a part. We won't allow climate collapse and chaos to take that away from us. And the more we start to think of human beings in that way, the more we will reject the every man for himself story that the post-apocalyptic future movies portray. Van der Linden says, changing the way we view ourselves also affects how we view our potential, our future. There is one movie that takes place in the future that does not assume all hope is definitely lost. And that is Peter Joseph's new film, Interreflections. It's a kind of experimental, fictional, pseudo-documentary following characters in 3 different timelines, one of a young woman in the present day, one timeline during the Great Transition that's in the future somewhere, and then a 3rd timeline further in the future in which scholars reflect on the times before and after the Great Transition. It's a good 2 hours and 45 minutes long, and several times it breaks the 4th wall to self-deprecatingly remark on how pretentious it is. And it is pretentious, and probably also an hour too long. The whole timeline of the woman in the present day could probably be cut. I don't know, it's tedious, she doesn't do much, but it is also unabashedly sincere in its optimism and solutions to the problems that we face. Spoiler alert for this movie too, but one of the very last scenes is of a news crew showcasing the first city that helped facilitate the Great Transition, how energy is generated, how society is structured, how innovations are developed, and how they govern themselves. It's astonishing, and just without being completely far-fetched. The newscaster echoed my own feelings exactly when, at the end of the tour, he asked, "So, where can I sign up?" Some may consider this movie to be full of naive hope, but I see it as a new sense of purpose and possibility, to borrow a phrase from Naresh Giogrande in the dialogue on Collapse and Hope. With all that in mind, I'd like to return now to our popcorn movie dystopia. I'm going to lift a really long quote right now because it is a slice of fried gold. So Cody and the Some More News crew, if you somehow find this sermon on YouTube, you are amazing, and thank you so much for this message, and we love you very much. Okay, here we go. Johnson concludes, quote, "Maybe we are in the opening crawl of some dumb dystopian movie. And maybe it's very easy to assume, based on everything movies tell us, that we're going to be one of the last generations. We've been conditioned by the media to expect as much, and reality isn't helping. And it's easy to just give up because of that, and imprint that doomsaying headspace onto the next generation. But maybe that's not a great thing to do, because it's not a movie. There's a reason the opening text is the opening text and not the movie itself, because movies always go as far as the most dramatic version, the worst case version. There are no movies about scientists warning a president of something, everybody heeding that warning, and then doing the work to avoid the disaster. We've internalized that a bit, and it's easy to forget that it's never too late to do the boring, less cinematic work of avoiding some kind of fascist dictatorship or a superheated wasteland. Humans can adapt to problems like climate change. We can make it out okay by panicking and doing something. Humans, when their backs are against the wall, survive as a species. That's what we do. But human beings have a concept of time and cause and effect, and we don't have to wait until our backs are against the wall. So yes, things are scary, but we're not stuck in the opening crawl. We're just still in the opening crawl. We can change things. It feels like the end of the world, and we need to panic a little bit about that, but then use that panic to do the work to fix it. And we humans are good at that. So ultimately, we have nothing to fear, especially fear itself. We like fear. Fear is how we solve this, unquote. Doom-mongering and nihilistic despair is not going to solve our problems and is actually counterproductive. But neither will the naive hope that everything is going to turn out fine without any action to back it up. We have to be realistic about the problems we face, yes, and we have to be optimistic that we can solve them, sure, but we also have to do the work. We can't be passive extras in real life. We have to harness those 5 things that give our lives purpose and meaning to solve this. Use our connections with others and establish new ones to create the change that we want to see in the world. Get involved in a mutual aid network. Call our congresspeople and demand transformative climate action. Those of us who are in Arizona elected Senator Mark Kelly, and he might actually be willing to listen to us, hopefully. If you don't know where to start or what to demand, Project Drawdown has a great resource on climate solutions if you want to check it out. It's drawdown.org. And this might seem counterintuitive, but according to atmospheric scientist Katherine Hayhoe, the most important thing we can do to help solve climate change is to talk about it with the people we know. She says that the key to having a real discussion is to connect over shared values like family, community, and religion. It has a much stronger impact than simply doom-mongering about statistics, as we are wont to do. Doing the work may be tedious. It may be tiring. You may feel like Sam Bridges, loaded with cargo on your back, trudging alone through a barren wasteland, but it's work that needs to be done, and you're not alone. Others are doing the work with you, even if you can't see them, encouraging and helping you every step of the way as you encourage and help them in return. Van der Linden said, ultimately, Sam didn't promise the people of the United Cities of America the values of connections. He exemplified it through his actions. All we have is today, one brief moment, one fighting chance that we were given by those who came before us, those who suffered for us, who sacrificed for us, and who, through love and connection, built a bridge to the future and placed tomorrow in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Emily's talk was described in the order of service not as a sermon, but as a reflection. I think you'll agree that she's given us much to reflect upon. Thanks again, Emily. We conclude today's service with a unison reading of West Valley's mission statement, after which we will extinguish the chalice and the postlude will be played. We agree to provide a safe place to celebrate diversity, draw inspiration for living better lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches. I offer these closing words. Love is active, not passive. It is our love for one another, for Mother Earth, for our fellow creatures that compels us to act on their behalf. As we extinguish our chalice, bringing today's service to a close, I offer these words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again. Before moving on to the postlude music, let us join in thanking those whose dedication, capabilities, and generosity have made this service possible. Paul and Barry as co-hosts, Jan, our office manager, for keeping us informed, Paul for his selections of just the right music for the recording and for the recording of our musicians, being technical advisor and manning the controls, and of course, Emily. Thanks again, Emily. There will be a brief pause following the postlude music while Paul changes the mute settings.